Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 35. He hadn't thought really that he would remember any bases aside from the ones that he'd seen on Zola's map. His memory, it seemed, held far more than that. Tony took in the sight of the scepter, finally allowed himself to take a deep breath to calm down. The stick of doom was in his sights now. He'd go right on ahead. He'd grab it. This whole nightmare would be over. He'd be able to live in the tower again without having to wonder when he'd be called out again. He'd be able to hold Jamie close without having to try to figure out when his past would catch up with him, and he'd try once again to play the middleman. He'd be able to put the evidence before the UN panel and prove to them that the Avengers were to be trusted, that for all their dubious decisions, good intentions informed their choices. He would be able to keep this whole spiraling freaking vortex under control, even when the whole universe seemed to be against him. He took a step closer, eyes still locked on the scepter. He tried as hard as he could not to look at any of the rest of his surroundings. The Chitauri artifacts taking up most of the cavern-like space made his skin feel too tight and his breath come too fast. There was a goddamn Leviathan hanging under the ceiling, and Tony was going to have to book double sessions with Jeff for a few weeks after this, wasn't he? Definitely ignoring the cold shudders erupting along his spine, Tony took yet another step closer to the scepter. Tony blinked, and suddenly everything seemed unreal, dreamlike, almost. Somehow his movements seemed almost beyond his own control when he lifted his head and looked up straight at the Chitauri Leviathan. And then right before his eyes, the corpse came back to life, flexing its muscles as it floated overhead. And then another, and another, and another, and the sky was full of those ugly spaceships Tony had seen on the other side of the wormhole. He could see stars and the blackness of space, and he felt his heart pick up speed, felt his lungs close up. Cold sweat sprang up along the back of his neck, the skin of his face. The icy cold of space washed over him. Tony's hands began to shake. His knees threatened to buckle, and he'd have thought that with the amount of time he'd spent in therapy, he'd be marginally more prepared for this. The ground seemed to solidify beneath his feet, and he looked around himself. He took in the sight of a rocky, barren landscape around himself. It was nowhere he recognized, lifeless and cold. And then he saw them. The Hulk first, big as a house, even lying down, drawing in what Tony was scared as fuck might very well be his last labored breath. The Hulk breathed out and lay still. Swallowing around the sudden sharp lump in his throat, Tony walked forward, took in the rest of the scene. They were all there, Natasha and Clint and Thor and Steve, shield cracked down the middle. None of them were moving. None of them even appeared to be breathing. Trembling, Tony walked around them. And then he collapsed. His legs refused to carry him. His heart refused to keep on beating. He could barely think. Pepper was there, and ruddy and happy, and splayed across them, white as snow, blood trickling out the corner of his mouth. Jamie blinked up at him sluggishly. For a moment, those beautiful gray eyes of his were completely empty. And then they flooded with emotion, fear, and betrayal and blame, and Tony's heart cracked into a million pieces just looking at him. Jamie opened his mouth, tried to speak. All that left him was a rattling gasp and another few drops of blood. And then his eyes grew empty again. Lifeless. Dead. Like it would have been if Hydra had succeeded. Because he was just a child who couldn't do what was needed while Tony was alive. Because he could do damn near anything that was possible with technology. Because Hydra had determined that Jamie was a threat, an unnecessary one, while they'd concluded, based on whatever fucked up data they had, that Tony would work with them, and Tony bit back a scream. Then he blinked. Reality formed around him once again, and he was back in Hydra's fucking basement, full of mummified alien remains and strange experiments, cages, and poorly made robots. And the scepter. There was the scepter. Still barely managing to breathe, Tony reached for his Iron Man gauntlet and picked up the scepter. Tony let himself delve more deeply into takeoff and setting the route back to New York than he usually would have. He needed the time to calm himself to make sure his hands weren't shaking and his breathing patterns sounded halfway all right. He needed to... Every single time he shut his eyes, all he could see was the light fading out of Jamie's. Plan. He needed a plan. And he needed to take care of the practical stuff. He typed in the commands to Jarvis that would make the Iron Legion take care of Strucker and the rest of the prisoners. He double-checked that the files he'd gotten from the base had been uploaded and properly sent on to the tower, where Hill could begin to sort through them. He sent an email off to Helen Cho and let out a relieved breath when she returned a confirmation almost immediately. He cast a glance at where they were storing the scepter before steeling himself and turning toward the others. "Hey, Brucey," he said. "Dr. Cho is on her way in from Seoul. Is it okay if she sits up in your lab?" Bruce, disconcertingly pale, blinked up at him. Yeah," he said, voice hoarse. "She knows her way around." Tony tried to flash him a smile, but gave up. He was not in the right headspace for it to possibly come out as anything other than a grimace. He liked Bruce, and he liked Cho, especially for her role in cleaning up his and Jamie's case of extremists, but somehow he couldn't translate that to liking the whole situation, at least not right now. "Thanks," he said at last before turning back to the controls. "Tell her to prep everything," he told Jarvis. "Barton's gonna need the full treatment." "Very well, sir," Jarvis said. "I have taken the liberty of informing Master James that you are in good health. He would like you to give him a call as soon as you are able." "Thanks, Jarv," Tony said. "Take the wheel, will you?" "Yes, sir," Jarvis replied. "Approach vector is locked." Tony got up off the pilot's seat and walked over to the scepter container, glancing down the damn stick-a-doom. He was caught somewhere between frightened just looking at it and needing so badly to study it to pick it apart and understand it, and why shouldn't he? With what was coming, with what he had allowed himself to forget was coming, he needed to be better, smarter, needed every bit of knowledge, every tiny advantage he could get. "It feels good, yeah?" he told Thor, almost absent-mindedly. His mind was still racing. "I mean, we've been after this thing since S.H.I.E.L.D. collapsed." And Thor, with his whole thing with guilt over Loki and not making sure to bring the scepter to Asgard in the first place, had been more determined than any of them ever since he returned to Earth. "Not that I haven't enjoyed our little raising parties," Tony added, but he didn't need to finish. They all knew he'd rather be home with Jamie than running all over the world playing whack-a-mole with Hydra. "No, but this..." Thor looked at the scepter with something very like relief on his face before looking up and meeting Tony's eyes with a smile that was surprisingly restrained for the big guy. "This brings it to a close," he concluded with rather more understanding in his voice than Tony would have expected. "As soon as we find out what else it's been used for," Steve said. He sounded tired, determined, and resigned, both at once somehow. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Tony could feel that curiosity again, that need to know what Steve's side project was. It was easier than normal to disregard the temptation to just find out. "And I don't just mean weapons," Steve added. "Since when is Strucker capable of human enhancement?" Tony felt a rush of relief. There was his opening. "Bruce and I will give it the once-over before it goes back to Asgard. Is that cool with you?" Thor nodded. "I mean just a few days until the farewell party. You're staying, right?" And he was maybe talking a bit too fast, trying a bit too hard to cover up his need to know the scepter to find out, learn, prepare. Thankfully, everyone was too exhausted to call him out on it. Yes, of course," Thor said. "A victory should be honored with revels." Tony tried to smile, but ended up just leaning forwards, putting his weight on his hands. Bucky was tired. When did he get so tired? He was still younger than he'd been for years before Afghanistan. Did being a father really make such a huge difference? Yeah, who doesn't love rebels, Captain? "Hopefully this puts an end to the Chitauri and Hydra," Steve said, and he was smiling now, probably anticipating returning to his own project. "So yes, revels!" Tony put the Quinjet down on the tower landing pad, and for a moment he had to blink at just how much the tower had changed over the past year in order to accommodate the Avengers. How had he never noticed? Cho's people were already taking Clint away when Tony turned away from the controls and let Jarvis finish the shutdown sequence. Hill walked into the Quinjet, Stark pad held under one arm. "Lab's all set up, boss," she said. "Yeah, I'll be heading down in a moment," Tony said. "Debrief the captain, would you?" He got out of the seat and checked over the controls one more time before following them towards the exit, already itching for the scepter. "What's the word on Strucker?" Steve was asking. "NATO's got him, and the rest of the people you took prisoner," Hill answered. "The two enhanced?" Steve asked, and Tony was half tempted to stick around to hear everything they had on them, but doubtless Hill had already sent everything to Jarvis, and Tony could read it all far faster down in the lab than he could listen to it here. "Wanda and Pietro Maximov," Hill was saying, even as Tony began to head in the other direction. "Twins, orphaned at 10 when a show collapsed their apartment building. We believe they have a child with them, possible enhanced, unaccounted for so far, but in their files as a resident of the base. 6 years old. White, brown hair, brown eyes. On file just as Johanny, and everything else is apparently on such a need-to-know basis, it's not on their servers. Keep an eye out for her as well, though. Will do, Steve said. She'll in their apartment building. Tony moved out of hearing range before he heard Hill's answer. He needed to check up on Joe and Clint, and then he was headed straight for the computer lab he shared with Bruce. He wanted the scepter scanned and analyzed. Needed to understand the thing yesterday. Right now, he couldn't possibly worry about anything else. Before he got that far, though, a blur of brown hair, pale skin, and blue t-shirt slammed into him, and Tony picked Jamie up, pressed the kiss to his temple, and hugged it tight. Did you find it? Jamie asked. Thought I already told you that, Tony said, settling Jamie against his side and continuing on toward Bruce's occupied lab. For all that Jamie was still small for his age, just like Tony had always been, he was getting too big for this. Another year or two, and Tony wouldn't be able to carry him anywhere nearly as comfortably anymore. That thought probably shouldn't sadden him nearly as much as it did. Jamie nodded. You did, he said. I was distracted. Maria's scared. She doesn't know what's going on, and now she's hiding with her friends. Tony winced. Jamie's imagination was oppressive and ever so slightly scary, and Tony was more than ready for this whole imaginary friend gag to just be over. I'm sure she'll be fine, he said at last. You did say your friends were older, didn't you? Jamie nodded and squirmed down onto the floor. I've got homework, he said almost proudly, before heading off towards the elevator, their private floor, and his room. Tony let out a breath, felt the anxiety settle over him again as he walked through the door.